Today we're going to be talking about addiction and whether it is a choice or a disease. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse in 2015, an estimated 9.4% of the American population uses illicit drugs. That is about 24.6 million people. As that number continues to rise each year, so does the number of drug-related deaths. How many more parents will have to sit through their child's funeral simply because they refuse to accept that their baby could be an addict? Addiction doesn't discriminate. It affects all walks of life, regardless of color or socioeconomic status. As someone who struggles with addiction, I know firsthand what addiction is capable of. The question becomes, is addiction a choice or a disease? I will talk about how genetics and repeated behaviors affect the brain and take choice out of the equation. Statistically speaking, the children of addictive parents are 8 times more likely to become addicts themselves. Why is this? According to Bloom, 2015, variations in the brain reward center, which control the amount of dopamine released from the brain, may result in the propensity for someone to have addictive behaviors. Genetic and environmental variations can cause breakdowns in the reward center and can lead to reward deficiency syndrome. In other words, it's kind of like a person may have a higher genetic predisposition to addictive behaviors and or could use because of how certain neurotransmitters fire in the brain. Because of this, you can make a direct correlation to the theory of cognitive neuroscience and how the brain can increase someone's likelihood to use. Behavioral changes are another part of addiction and its characterization as a disease. And the theory of classical conditioning is a prime example of what happens from continuous drug use and the effect that it can have on the brain. First, because drugs act as a booster of a person's dopamine, the brain's natural pleasure receptors are disrupted. As a result, people's ability to feel pleasure is significantly reduced, and the drug becomes basically the only thing that will give them the original high that they desire. The problem with this is the brain then becomes accustomed to the drug and a tolerance is formed. Once there is a tolerance that is formed, the user will need more and more of that drug or substance in order to feel the high again. The next stage of the conditioning process is dependence. In addiction, there is both a physical and a psychological dependence contingent on what kind of drug is used. Consider opiates such as heroin, let's say morphine, codeine is also an opiate. With these, addiction to any one of them, there is psychological and physical consequences. Now, opiates affect the brain by attaching to something called opioid receptor sites, which reduce the perception of pain. When they are consistently taken and a dependence to the drug is established, a certain physical withdrawal will come after. Also, habitual behavior of any opiate addicts mean that there's going to be adverse symptoms of the drug withdrawal that are frequently experienced, and subsequent exposure to these stimuli alone can elicit this kind of conditioned response. This cycle of Pavlovian conditioning is extremely difficult to break once it begins. Another factor is positive reinforcement to the disease of addiction. Because people like the feeling of pleasure and happiness, they will echo the activity that triggered the pleasurable experience. Drugs like cocaine, meth, ecstasy, all these raise the level of the dopamine in your system and act as a positive reinforcement for continued drug use. The problem with continued drug use is that it messes with the natural levels of dopamine in your system or body. Once that tolerance is built, it will take more and more of the drug that you're taking to feel that positive reinforcement or the initial high again, which is why addiction is considered a progressive disease, because the brain is constantly trying to find ways to find that pleasure again. Another factor is negative reinforcement. This can motivate continued drug use, and whether the addict uses to get relief from a stressful situation, say, or from physical pain, the ultimate escape is the desired outcome. According to Baker back in 2004, the avoidance of a negative effect can be a powerful motivator for continued drug use. He uses this example of withdrawal symptoms, and it's primarily from opiates, to demonstrate the power that physical dependence can have on the users. When opiates are taken for extended periods of time, the receptors in the brain become desensitized. Now, as a result of this, again, more and more of the drug is needed to create that same initial effect. When an addict abruptly stops, those withdrawal symptoms are going to become more severe because the opiate receptor sites are no longer being fed. The opiate withdrawal symptoms can include cold sweats, vomiting, diarrhea, bone aches, skin crawling, runny noses, muscle aches, insomnia. Basically every horrible thing you can think of you're going to get with opiate withdrawal. Opponents to this view might argue that relapse can occur long after withdrawal symptoms have stopped. Although this might be true, physical dependence is still a prime example of negative reinforcements and its effect on continued drug use. Finally, my personal experience. My personal experience with drugs may help my audience understand why I believe addiction is not a choice. In high school, I was a straight A student. I was a premier soccer player. By sophomore year of high school, I was already getting recruiting letters from top universities around the country. Examples, Cal Berkeley, Cal Poly, UC Irvine, UNLV. I guess you could say I was one of those most likely to succeed type of kids. My junior year of high school, however, that all changed for the worst. I was injured in the Valley Championships of a soccer game. I was taken out outside the 18 box and ended up having to have knee surgery. Now, post-knee surgery, I was prescribed Vicodin, which is a commonly prescribed opiate. That Vicodin ended up leading to an Oxycontin addiction, which is basically Vicodin times 10, times 20, which then led to a full-blown heroin addiction. Now, these opiates took over my life, both physically and psychologically. The classical conditioning that I mentioned earlier and the reinforcement theories were in full effect in my life during this period of time. I had absolutely no control. What began with a choice to take the initial drug led me on a road of addiction that ended up changing my behavior. It changed my way of thinking and ultimately changed my life. It's no question that drugs are powerful, but how powerful really are they? The answer lies on the addict's devotion to his next fix. This compulsive drug-seeking behavior is the reason why relapse is so common. It is the reason why addicts hurt themselves. It is the reason why addicts hurt the people around them. And it is the reason why addiction should be considered a disease. Therefore, like any other disease, addiction needs to be treated with medication. Whether it be a support group, a religion, therapy, treatment, any one of these an addict is going to need for his or her recovery. However, how do you know that the addict will be receptive to treatment? Well, someone once told me that if the fear of remaining the same is greater than the fear to change, then you will simply change. For me, the change was my only option. I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I've had 3 friends who have died from heroin overdoses in the past 6 months. And as hard as that was to stomach, it reminds me that my disease is constantly trying to take my life. And that reminder is what keeps me sober today. So I'm going to open up this to questions from my audience. We have Lauren, who has a question first.
Yeah, how do you know you are an addict?
How do you know you're an addict? There are many signs that will show that somebody is an addict, but ultimately, what the deciding factor is they totally lose control or power over their life. The drug takes control, it controls their decisions, it controls what they do, what they like to do, it takes the joy out of certain things, and ultimately takes them down a path that keeps getting worse. It's a progressive disease, and there are signs though to look out for if you have kids. You know, there's things, their grades might drop. You know, they will lose interest in things they once liked, but ultimately their lives become unmanageable. Let's see, Megan, I think you had a question next.
If addiction is a disease, how do you know if someone is cured?
The simple answer to that question is there is no cure for this disease of addiction. There is only treatment. And for me, who is a struggling or recovering heroin addict, I need things like recovery meetings. I need, a support group. I have a sponsor. This is like my medication for my disease of addiction. To say that there's a cure is not really accurate because this is a lifelong thing. When people say that they have a cure for this disease, who are addicts or they've been cured, is when they usually fall back into that disease. So this is something that you want to continue to work on throughout your life. And if that's all I have to do to remain sober is go to a few meetings, that it will be all worth it, because I am not going to end up one of those statistics who dies from an overdose. But that about wraps it up for today. Thank you very much for listening to my speech, and I will see you guys next time.